Greetings out there in YouTube land. I hope things are going well. Today's video epic is going to focus on this monolithic looking box that stands before you. A friend of mine found this at a garage sale and traded it to me recently for some amplifier repair work. So I hauled it in and set it up on the workbench just like you see it, which prompted Rusty to ask the obvious question. And in response to Rusty and probably your curiosity, let's open it up and see what's inside. And lo and behold, what we have here is a Newcomb Pathfinder public address system. It comes with two 12-inch Oxford speakers that are date-coded from the 18th week of 1968, and then a really nice amplifier that you see nestled at the bottom of that cabinet. The amp originally came with the very typical late 60s black plastic knob like this, which would have been just fine except it was missing one of them. And you know the nightmare trying to match existing knobs, so I took the easy way out, pulled off the 4 knobs I had, and ordered 5 chicken heads to replace them. I think the chicken heads give it kind of an old-fashioned sort of vintage look, which I prefer. That big metal heat shield on top that you see was originally painted a really sickly kind of a pea green color, which I just couldn't endure. So I had some spray paint left over from restoring 50s Seeburg jukeboxes. And this is sort of that diner turquoise color, which I sprayed. I thought it would kind of suit the amp and its vintage, and so I redid the heat shield with that paint. As you notice, the speakers come with about 2 light years of speaker cord, and normally the ends would screw onto terminals on the back of the amp, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. Fortunately though, the amp, before I got it, was converted to speaker output jacks, the 1/4-inch jack, so those have been added to the end of each of the cables. As you can see, even though these speakers are labeled Newcomb, 465 is Oxford, and it'd be the 18th week of 1968. Now these are really nice looking ceramic 12-inch Oxford speakers, but unfortunately they're really unsuitable for guitar use because they're mid-range speakers. Remember, this was a PA system originally, and so there wasn't a whole lot of need for a great deal of bass or treble frequency portrayal. Therefore, for this little amp to really reach its potential, we're going to have to hook it up to a good quality guitar amp friendly speaker. Okay, let's just take a quick look around the amp here. On this side, this is for the input. It says for microphone, but this is where the guitar is plugged into the amp. We got those wonderful chicken heads clucking away there on the front. And over here is where it's been modified for 1/4-inch jacks for the speakers. Now let's take a look at the back. Now the rear of the amp is really very interesting. First we have a phono input, which probably is never going to get used. But the real good news is that this amp comes with a very complex output transformer. It has 4 ohm output, 8 ohm, 16 ohm, 25 volt, and 70 volt output. Now granted, these are for PA use, but the 4, 8, and 16 ohm outputs are very useful. Now the way you select the output impedance is really snazzy. Remember, there are 2 output jacks for the speakers. So say I'm going to plug in 2 separate speakers, each 8 ohms. Now these jacks are wired in parallel, so that would be a 4 ohm load. I then would come over here, undo the jumper, and put it down here at the 4 ohm output, and now my impedance is matched. If I had a single 8 ohm speaker, as we're going to in a few minutes, or say a couple 16s in parallel, then I run the jumper over here to 8 ohms. So you have all sorts of flexibility here in what type of speaker cabinet or speakers that you can connect to. Also, this is an ultra-linear output transformer, which we'll discuss what that means and the implications of it in a few minutes. Also, there's a hum balance control here where we can reduce the hum due to the 6-volt filament voltage supply. Also, there's a nice turntable AC outlet on the back, so we can hook up our trusty Girard turntable to play our old Led Zeppelin albums, or maybe our electroshock paddles, or a respirator, or something else that we old timers sometimes need when we get carried away playing our guitar. It came with a wretched 2-prong plug that was in pretty bad shape. It looked like it had been trampled by Clydesdales, so I put on the nice, reliable, grounded 3-wire cable. Now the controls are sort of a little quirky and interesting. We've got the indicator light here, but for the on-off switch is piggybacked onto the treble control instead of the volume control as you normally see. So step 1 then, of course, is turning it on, setting the treble. We have a separate bass control here. Then we have a volume control for the phono input, which probably won't get used much. And then we have a separate volume control for each of the guitar inputs. Also behind each switch there's a presettable sort of a position indicator, so that once you get a good setup here with the tone the way you like it, you can set these, and then you know to set your little chicken heads to coincide with that indicator. So if you're a little under the weather after guzzling about 4 liters of Mad Dog 2020, this will help you set up your amp properly, and you won't disappoint your audience much. Now, with the accompaniment of the theme song from 2001: A Space Odyssey, let's remove this heat shield from the top of the amp and take a look. Well, Rusty, are you ready to get to work? I guess not. Now, here's where things get downright exciting. First off, an absolutely mint, put it in the box and sell it for new RCA 5Y3. Okay, now grab a hold of something so you don't lose your balance. A matched pair of British Mullard EL84s. Okay, if I've got your attention, how about another Mullard 12AX7? And then a beautiful RCA 6BR8. Now that's an unusual tube. We'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few seconds to get your heartbeat back under control, and then we'll continue. Now, if you're through hyperventilating over the tubes, this is a ultralinear output transformer. Like I said, we'll discuss that in a second when we look at the schematic. And then look at this power transformer. You couldn't ask for a huskier, nicer power transformer. Now, bear in mind, when you find something like this at a garage sale and they say, oh, old PA system, and you turn your nose up at it, maybe that's a mistake. Because you could probably buy this whole thing at a, like I said, you get the right person at the garage sale for $25 or $30. That would barely buy you the rectifier tube. These, I don't even want to speculate on these 3 tubes. The value, though, is quite significant. So my point is, don't be a snob. When you see a great big box PA system and you think, oh, who wants that? Well, I want it, and you should too. If for nothing else, the tubes that are in it, let alone that this is a just beautifully designed and crafted amplifier with the highest possible quality components. And if you could get this for $25 or $35 at a garage sale, I think it'd be one of the best days of your life. Okay, let's take our Valium and flip this over and take a look underneath. Now, let's take a look at the schematic before we look inside the chassis. And Newcomb has a really great habit of putting schematics in the cabinet. In this case, this schematic was attached to the floor of the chassis. I took a photograph of it and blew it up. That's why it's a little dark and grainy. Let's look here. First, the 12AX7. Each of the triodes receives the input from either guitar 1 or guitar 2. Each of the triodes has its own separate volume control. And that brings us up here to that rather unusual tube, the 6BR8. Now we look here at the tube handbook, we'll see that the 6BR8 Reminds us a lot of the ECL86, also called a 6GW8, that some of you are familiar with in the Hammond AO44 chassis, in that it is a combination of a triode on one side and a pentode on the other. So it's sort of like a 12AX7 in which it is a dual tube. It has two sides, but it's asymmetrical. One side triode, one side pentode. Now the pentode side here is going to be used for preamp, and then we're going to send the signal over to the other side of the tube, the triode side, and use it as our phase inverter. The plate of the triode drives one of the 6 BQ5s, and the cathode of the other drives the second 6 BQ5. Which brings us to that miraculous output transformer. Now this, I said, was an ultralinear output transformer. It's the first one I've ever encountered because I don't deal with hi-fi stuff. And generally these transformers are used in hi-fi equipment to reduce distortion. I know that's a bad thing for us involved with guitars, but let's take a look at how it works. First off, we're familiar with the primary being connected to the plates of the output tube, but in this case the screens have their own winding on the output transformer. Most of us are accustomed to having the screens powered by one of the takeoffs from the B+ rail that comes out of the rectifier. But in this case, the screens have their own windings on the output transformer, which effectively reduces distortion. Then over here we see the very complex secondary that gives us 4, 8, 16 ohm output capability, and a couple others that we'll probably never use. Now, I'm going to give you a little hint. When you're converting PA amplifiers over for guitar use, one drawback of PA amps is they tend to be mid-range intensive with almost no bass or treble to speak of. You notice the speakers that came with this thing? They were made strictly for mid-range, for voice, and maybe some scratchy old record player music. But for guitar use, if you want to warm it up and give it a lot more life and make the sound much more dynamic, what I did, I only had to make one modification, and that is I came here to the pentode part of the 6BR8, and where it has the 100 ohm biasing resistor, I bypassed it with a 50 microfarad at 100 volt capacitor, and it changed the whole nature of the amplifier. One small change coupled with those great transformers and those wonderful tubes, and you have as nice a sounding vintage amp as you could imagine. Now let's flip this jewel over and take a look at the circuitry. Once we flip it over, we see that in typical Newcomb fashion, which means very highly and nicely engineered, we got the steel base plate here with the standoff feet, not rubber feet, but steel, so that the floor of the amp could never come in contact with the surface, and the louvers to allow air to circulate through the components within the chassis. Okay, let's remove this, and we notice also in Newcomb fashion we have our schematic right here glued onto the floor of the belly pan. Now let's take a look inside. And then when we look inside, to our pleasant surprise, it's every bit as nicer than the exterior. All the wiring is neat and point to point. There's clips to hold capacitors. Shielded cable is used in many places. Black cat molded capacitors. There is that cathode bypass capacitor that I added. And then back here we have the fuse holder inside the cabinet. Some may consider this to be sort of an inconvenient drawback, but I think it's a good idea. It keeps unqualified people from replacing the fuse. Now let's just finish our tour here of the interior. We'll see the beautiful, neat wiring. It's all point to point. There's no eyelet boards, circuit boards, turret boards, or diving boards, or any other kind of boards in this thing. It's all point to point, and I prefer that. because with those boards, there's all sorts of stuff going on underneath them that you can't see or test. With these, you can find every piece of the circuit is exposed to you, and you can go in and troubleshoot and replace parts much more easily. I think point-to-point was phased out because it was more labor intensive to do, and they went to those boards that were actually pre-made and then just inserted into the amp, sort of a way to speed up production. But when it comes down to sheer artistry of creation of electronic circuit, I don't think anything can match point-to-point. Well, enough blathering. Let's put the base plate back on this jewel and flip it over and plug it in and see if it sounds even half as good as it looks. Well, Rusty, you ready for a fabulous guitar concert? Okay, we got the treble and bass chicken heads headed straight up at the mid-range, 5 out of 10, and the volume is just between 1 and 2. I have to say that it has really good bass and treble response now. Good balanced output. It tends to remain clean. It's hard to overdrive it, but I think the tone is really excellent, and this would be the type of amp that would work well, I think, with different pedals, reverb pedals and overdrive and things of that sort. Well, that about does it for today's video featuring the mighty Newcomb Pathfinder SPA-20, which is a little optimistic on the wattage. I'm thinking it's probably closer to 16 or 18 watts. Rusty and I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that you will subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Regardless, please stay tuned. We've got more magnificent video productions underway, and we hope to see you again in the near future. So thanks for watching, and bye for now.